Okay, chapter 1 is evidence of evolution. So we've been talking about natural selection, how that's the process and evolution is the outcome. So we're going to take a look at Darwin and his theory of evolution. Now, evolution is a great science of biology. If you take any biology class, I mean, biology is basically funded on the principles of evolution. Evolution was brought together by Charles Darwin and Alfred Wallace. They thought of this idea independently. Alfred Wallace was more on the geological side. Charles Darwin was more on the animal side. But when Charles Darwin heard that Alfred Wallace had the same idea, it was a mad rush to publish his book, On the Origin of Species. But Charles Darwin and Alfred Wallace actually did present their theories together at a conference to the scientific world. Evolution ranks among Copernicus' theory of the sun at the center of the solar system, Newton's law of motion, Einstein's theory of relativity. So it was a pretty groundbreaking moment in the scientific world. But this breakthrough was not easy. At the time, the lead-in theory was called special creation, which means that all species were created by God 6,000 years ago, and that these species, once they were created, they were incapable of changing. And we know that's not true, and organisms do change over time. But one thing that Darwin was faulted on was that he believed that this process was very, very slow. And as I discussed yesterday, evolution can happen over a short period of time. But he knew that he thought that the Earth was a lot older than 6,000 years old, and that species do change throughout time. In order for a theory to be a theory, you kind of need to have two things, a pattern and a process. So the pattern just means that looking at many, many observations, it all correlates into a simple statement or summarizes it. Darwin had the pattern. His book On the Origin of Species, if you do go into the scientific field for your occupation, I highly suggest that you do read it and just suffer through it. Just suffer through it. Just read it once in your life so you know what this guy wrote like. It was very dry. It was all factual. Many, 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 many thousands of observations. Okay, this guy, he wrote down every single thought that practically went through his mind, and it's very, very, like I said, dry. But the thing that Darwin lacked was a process. Natural selection didn't come about until afterwards. So the theory of evolution, we're going to take a look at four kind of pieces of evidence. Natural selection, how changes do evolve. We'll look at the fossil record. We'll look at anatomical structures of organisms. We'll talk a little bit about molecular biology and biogeography. So this is a nice little flow chart of where we are going to go. This covers it up, but it says similar genes on your notes. So we'll look at the fossil record. We'll look at how organisms were distributed throughout the world, suggesting a common ancestral species. We'll look at homologous structures, which hopefully that rings a bell for my biology kids. And then we'll also look at similarities in early developments in embryos. So start off with Darwin's famous Galapagos finches, kind of the first breakthrough for Darwin. Now, quick story about Darwin. When he was growing up, his father wanted him to be a doctor or a pastor, both very prominent occupations to have. But Darwin, he couldn't be a doctor because he would faint at the sight of blood, basically. So you can't really be a doctor if you have a problem with that. And he really didn't want to be a pastor, so to kind of escape his decision on what to become, his best friend's like, hey, I'm going on a voyage, I want to be my unofficial naturalist. And Darwin's like, heck yeah. And so Darwin was the unofficial naturalist, but he did take his job very seriously. So he sailed around the world with one of his good friends, keeping him company, and started to record species that he encountered on different continents. But the Galapagos Islands, back in 1835, he collected 31 species of finches from 3 different islands, but the problem is he was an unofficial naturalist, so he had troubles identifying them. He thought they were different species like worms, grosbeaks, and blackbirds. So what he did is he took these species back to England, and he had a guy named John Goud look at them. And John said, hey, Darwin, you actually have a group of distinct species, and they're all actually very similar to each other. Today there are 14 recognized finches. You might want to highlight that, guaranteed test question. 14. And so here's a list of just some of them. I think it shows 10. But you can see that they're all grouped according to what kind of food that they eat. Fruit eaters, insect eaters, cactus eaters, seed eaters, and then talks about the type of bills that they have. and then the types of finches, so ground finches, warbler finch, tree finches. So the unique thing about these finches is that they exhibited different variations, and it all came from food gathering. So what kind of food that they eat, and then the food that they ate reflected the beak that they had. And so here was a hypothesis in quotes from Darwin's book. Observations suggest difference among species in beak size and shape, and have evolved as the species adapted. So an actual quote. So with modern research, we've actually verified Darwin's selection hypothesis. Now, just a quick review of natural selection, you have to have 3 conditions. 1, variation must exist, and this is true with the finches. We have different beak sizes. 2, the variation must lead to difference among individuals in lifetime reproductive process. We don't know that yet, so we're going to examine that, but we have heard drought, rainy season, that different food is available, and thus different finches thrive. And then 3, the variation must be, you have to be able to pass it on to your offspring. Got to pass it on to the next generation. So these are the 3 conditions. And then I'm going to talk about 2 scientists who have basically dedicated their life to finches of the Galapagos Islands. I still hear some clickety-clack.
Yeah, I still can.
It's not charged?
No, it's dead.
It's already dead?
Yeah, it hasn't turned on yet.
He's dead.
Oh. So here are the 2 scientists that have basically dedicated their life. Peter and Rosemary Grant. At Gustavus actually threw a book called The Beak of the Finch. If you want to borrow it, let me know. It's a great book. But what they did is they studied the medium ground finch, and there's a scientific name for it, Geospiza fortis, on the island Daphne Major. And what these finch did is they fed on smaller tender seeds, but they would resort to the large drier seeds when those small seeds were depleted. So their optimal food was the smaller tender seeds, and then when that food was gone, then they would resort to the larger drier seeds. So kind of like our lac operon. Glucose is the optimal food source, but once glucose is gone, then it resorts to lactose. All right, okay. Anyways, what Peter and Rosemary Grant did is they measured every bird every single year. So they'd capture it, they would tag it, and they would measure their beak. And then they would release it, and they would come back the next year and do the same thing. And they would record, deaths, how the beak size has changed. What they did is they found a great deal in variation among the finches, and that the average beak depth did change year to year in a very predictable fashion due to the environmental conditions. Now remember, the 3 things that you need for natural selection, you have to be able to pass it on. So not only that, they actually measured the parent beaks, and they would study them and say, oh, hey, there's their offspring right there. So they'd tag those, and they would measure the beak sizes. So they actually kind of created like a huge family tree of all these finches. And what they noticed was that, yes, the depth of the beaks were passed down from one generation to the next, regardless of the environment. So if you had parents that had large beaks, then the offspring would also have large beaks regardless of the environment. So that means that, yes, there's differences among individuals in beak size that does reflect a genetic difference. So this trait is passed on to the next generation, basically. So here's a graph showing normal rainfall, so normal conditions versus a drought. And this is the number of finches. This is the beak depth. You can see here it's in millimeters. This is what they mean by beak depth this way. So here we have this nice little bell curve with the average around 9.5 during normal conditions. But during drought, notice that the average shifts above 10. And you really don't see organisms with small beaks here. So what kind of, if you remember, what kind of selection would this be? Disruptive, directional, or stabilizing? We learned about
Stabilizing.
Really? Okay, so you're saying stabilizing because both ends are kind of chopped off here? Is that why you're saying that? Okay, so maybe Hasbargen is really looking at this graph and he says, oh, look, there's some 12s here, but I'm not seeing any 12s here. So he's saying stabilizing where both ends are chopped off and we get an optimal. So yeah, you could definitely say stabilizing, but you could also, I think you could also argue directional because the average did change. So, very good. Here is the finch that they studied among the 14 finches. So here's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. And they all come from a common ancestor on the South American mainland. Now the Galapagos Islands are thousands of miles away from the mainland. And so you're probably wondering how in the world did a finch get out there? Well, there's been stories and studies that have shown that During large tropical storms, finches will get swept up into the atmosphere and travel thousands of miles. And so all of these finches, these 14 finches, came from one common ancestor. And I'm going to emphasize that because that is also a test question. One common ancestor. So from 14 or from 14 finches evolved.
I like these test questions that you're giving us. You should give us a few more.
Okay. Okay, moving on to more evidence for natural selection and evolution. Let's switch gears and talk about the peppered moths and industrial melanism. So yes, when environment changes, we know that natural selection may favor certain traits in some species, in that species over different traits. So we're going to look at moths here. We have peppered moths. They come in a wide range of shades, usually from light gray to speckled to jet black. And then, so this moth color, light gray to speckled to jet black, is actually a genetic trait. There's different alleles for it on a single gene. Now, before the 1850s, the black moths were very rare. But then after the 1850s, they became dominant. And so the question is, what happened here?
Coal plants.
Coal plants, okay, the Industrial Revolution. And so these black moths increased during the industrial regions of cities because, you know, coal was a great source of energy, and we were just taken off with companies and factories. So these black moths became more dominant. So here's cool slides here. Notice the black moth on this lichen-covered trunk kind of sticks out like a sore thumb. If you were a bird, you'd probably eat that.
Probably.
Lichen-free, soot-covered tree, if you were a white kind of speckled moth, you would stick out like a sore thumb, so you would be eaten. Here's
Sorry, 9:30.
All right.
Here's a trunk that's been covered in soot, and notice that the black moth just kind of blends right in, and the white one sticks out. Yeah, it's right here. This one, believe it or not, does have a white moth, and I still haven't been able to find it.
It's right there in the corner right there. Yeah.
Right here?
It is not.
Yeah,
I don't know. But the black one definitely sticks out. This is lichen. This lichen comes in shades of green and white, and there is a white moth on there. I swear it says so in the caption that I took it from. I still haven't been able to find it. So.
Yeah, I found it right there.
Okay.
It's right in that bottom biology section.
Okay, so
You're blind.
light-colored moths decreased because of selection by predation, because they stuck out on the soot-covered bark, so the birds would eat them. So J.W. Tutts suggested that these peppered forms were more visible to predators on the sooty trees and that have lost their lichen. So they, like I said, stuck out. Bernard Kettlewell released the same number of light and dark moths into two sets of woods. One of the woods was polluted, so that was Birmingham, and one was unpolluted, that was in Dorset. And he set out traps to see how many he could recapture. So in Birmingham, which was the polluted one, he caught more dark than white. So that means the dark ones survived and the white ones were heavy predation occurred. Okay, what is going on?
Kill them.
Finish on where the monster was.
And then while in Dorset, which was the unpolluted, it was covered with lichen, he caught more white than dark moths. Not only that, Bernard Kettlewell actually caught birds on film eaten, the ones that were selected against. And he did this in 8 different case studies. So, cool. So obviously Kettlewell, he provided strong evidence for natural selection. The birds were the agent of the selection. As you can see here, the birds were determining which ones would survive and which ones would die based on their camouflage. Okay, so when environmental conditions reverse, so does the selection pressure. Obviously, when these industrialized areas started to become cleaner, we actually got the trend to reverse. So in the second half of the 20th century, our white moths kind of came back, our black moths were rare, yeah. So this drop correlates well with the drop in air pollution, basically. Okay. So here's a graph showing the smoke pollution level, and you can see that our melanic moths, which are the black ones, yeah, have decreased. and a nice little table summarizing each case here. Now, like I said, agent of selection, it can be difficult to pin down. So like, remember, we think the birds are the natural selection agent here, but there's some discrepancies with this a little bit. Researchers have noticed that recent selection against melanism does not appear to correlate with changes in tree lichens. So what they're saying is that at one location, the light forms began to increase in frequency before the lichens reappeared. So what caused that? They don't know. Studies in Detroit, Michigan, lichens never changed significantly as the dark moths became more dominant and then they declined. In some cases, they couldn't find pepper moths at all, like the white ones. So they were wondering what happened to them. Could pollution be the agents? So there's some discrepancies with studies done in Detroit. They can never find peppered moths ever. So, unique, rare, I don't know.
But how could like pollution be an agent if it doesn't choose? 'Cause it's just like everywhere.
Well, like I said, with the peppered moths, maybe because they have a different environment, maybe there's more soot in certain areas. So like they don't know. They really don't know, and they won't know until they find peppered moths so they can study it and observe them. So not only can the environment and predators be a selection in evolution, but humans can too. Okay, so we call this artificial selection, where humans initiate the change. So during the 1920s and 1930s, genetics really took off, and we started to study Drosophila melanogaster, the fruit fly. And what humans were doing is they were selecting for various traits on Drosophila, and they were trying to figure out genes. So basically, they were altering everything about Drosophila to make sure that they'd always end up with a consistent result. So bristles on the abdomen, which I discussed yesterday. What they did is they took, the average number was 9.5 bristles on the abdomen. They took the top 20%. They reproduced after 86 generations. The number of bristles on those fruit flies were over 40. So yes, humans can be an agent for natural selection. We've also done this with crops. So here's a diagram showing corn. This is what corn used to look like before humans really kind of artificially selected certain traits of it. And you can see there's intermediates, and this is what modern day corn looks like today. We've done it with livestock. So here's a Belgian blue cattle that has been bred for increased meat production. It's very muscular,
It's really good.
scary.
It's shredded nice.
Yeah.
It's disgusting.
We've also taken different species and domesticated them. So cats, dogs, pigeons. For example, the greyhound has been bred for maximum running ability because of its long legs, its long tail, has this arched back to increase the stride length with great muscle mass. The Dutch hound was bred to enter narrow holes to hunt badgers. So
Yeah.
different functions for these species of dogs.
You can get such different dogs from the same thing.
Right. Now, dogs have been domesticated for over 10,000 years, and there's actually fossils of that in the fossil record. So it suggests that all dogs kind of came from one common ancestor. And so what this diagram is depicting, maybe it's the gray wolf, I don't know. But you can see that it's branched off in different species of dogs in Europe compared to North America, to China, to India, and how it just continues to branch off as humans select for different traits.
We have the coolest dogs.
Why is there no
Actually,
more for-
India has the coolest dogs, man. Check
There's
it
what?
out.
Why is there not another branch? from
They
the-
probably didn't have enough space.
And
This is not like a detailed diagram, it's just a
It's not exactly
simplified. It's just simplified. But with our domestication, it has led to unintentional selection for some traits. So the silver fox in Russia, its fur was prime, you know. But then as we started to domesticate them, because we kind of like their fur, but they started to say, oh, it's really cute. And they took the most docile silver fox, which were the tamed ones, the super nice. And they did it so extreme that these fox, they couldn't live without intention. Like they would whimper if they weren't petted constantly, and they would go up to owners and demand to be, you know, like petted and fed and hugged, and they just needed constant support, or I don't know, attention. What?
Their attention.
Yeah, basically. Which Fuego said, which I will not repeat on my recording here. So, yes. Okay. Move on to another branch of evidence, the fossil evidence for evolution. Now, in order for fossils to form, I just want to say that it's a very complicated process, because first your organism has to be buried in sediments. Then your calcium bones have to mineralize. And then the surrounding sediment eventually has to harden to form rock. So there's lots of, it's a very delicate process. It's very rare to come across a fossil because most times the decayed part of that organism gets scavenged by other organisms before the process can actually begin. Not only that, fossils, a lot of areas are inaccessible to humans. You know, you have to dig, obviously. But there's also erosion that goes on, so it could break down our fossils. The Earth is constantly changing. Plates are moving, plate tectonics, earthquakes, volcanoes damage fossils. So our fossil record is incomplete. Yeah, but we still use it for evidence because they're there. Okay. So we can tell the age of fossils by looking at radioactive decay. And there's two ways to do it. The first way is relative dating, looking at the position of the fossil. So if it was deep, deep, deep in the crust or the strata, then it would be very old, and we could compare layers and say, okay, this layer formed X thousands years ago, and determine how old it is that way. The other way is the absolute dating, when we look at radioactive decay, which is measured in half-lives, which is your favorite.
I'm never gonna
Okay.
understand.
So we'll look at isotopes like of uranium-238 or carbon-14 to determine how old the fossil really is. So we can age fossils. Okay, so with our fossils, we can array them from oldest to youngest, and we can see something called successive evolutionary change, how it has evolved through time. So yes, fossil records do document how organisms have changed over time. It kind of shows this waxing and waning of biodiversity. You know, we know that mass extinctions have occurred because the organisms that we find are not present today. So we know that dinosaurs did exist. They no longer exist today, and
They're just covering up the discovery of Pokemon.
I've never heard that before.
It's the truth. The truth comes out.
But fossils also document an evolutionary transition. Okay, so yes, there's gaps in our fossil record, and like I said, fossils are rare. You know, they have to be able to be preserved, and you also have to recover them in a safe way. But there are some intermediate forms that we have found out there, like the Archaeopteryx. I think I said that right. Ancient feather, an organism that lived 165 million years ago, which is the intermediate between birds and dinosaurs. So you can see that you can see the bones here, okay? And what they've noticed is like, oh my gosh, these rays down here, they're actually feathers. And this is a bad diagram. Maybe I should zoom in. I don't know if I can zoom in presentation mode. But they do resemble feathers. And so an artist took it upon themselves to try to draw it out to show it. Now, reptiles and birds, there is a link because a lot of the dinosaurs had like a reversed pelvis. I mean, if you watch Jurassic Park and Jurassic World, they talk about these features that they're shared with. The long legs, the hollow bones, so that, you know, they were preparing to possibly fly. Who knows?
Chicken.
But we can look at patterns seen in intermediate fossils, and we can say, hey, it has some traits like the ancestor compared to its descendants. We know that traits do evolve at different rates at different times. For example, four-legged aquatic mammals discovered that whales and dolphins formed from land-dwelling hooved ancestors, which is really hard to believe for some people. But I could argue with whales, why do whales have a pelvic bone?
Because they're creased.
They don't use it. They don't have hind limbs. Why do they have a pelvic bone? They do have a pelvic bone. So I'll show you a diagram here in the next couple slides.
That metal picture's gross.
Four-legged.
Yeah, that crocodile. How long can hippos hold their breath?
I thought it was like 8 to 20. I've heard 8 minutes, and I also heard 20 minutes, so I'm not sure. I learned it on the safari. I don't remember.
That's just due to their huge lungs or what?
Another transition organism bridged the gap between fish and the first amphibians, the Tiktaalik. I said that wrong, but here's the fossil of it. I don't know if this is a real picture of some common ancestor or organism that's living today that resembles it. Not sure, but you can see they know that they had fish that looked like this, and they have found bones that look like this, and they've also found organisms like this. So this guy must fit in between here because it shares common similarities with this guy and this guy. So, yeah.
Gross.
We've also looked at the evolution of horses. Great example. So the family Equidae, which includes our horses, zebras, and donkeys, they are large. They're long-legged, fast-moving animals, adapted to live on the grasslands. But there's only one genus left, genus Equus. That's the last living descendants of the family Equidae.
Didn't they start out like tiny?
Oh yeah. So the first horse was very, very small, kind of like the size of a dog. Had short legs, broad feet. But the main thing that I want to talk about horse here is the toe reduction. Okay, modern horses today just have a single toe. When they started off, they had 4 toes, with 3 on the hind feet, and it was in a fleshy pad. And so we've looked at fossils and we've seen that the length of the central toe drastically increases. We have this development of the bony hoof, reduction and loss of toes.
I want a horse with feet. Let me see.
Not only that, the tooth size and shape have changed. So we know that the teeth have increased in length. They developed ridges to chew on the tough grass. The skull had to lengthen to withstand the stresses of chomping on that grass. And these changes are correlated to changing global climates.
So what do you think it ate in the beginning? Good in grass.
Humans.
I have a picture of teeth coming up. Maybe we can take a look at it and determine it.
You're a moron, Zach.
Probably just leaves. I would say leaves. Leaves, yeah, or like moss. So here's a diagram showing your small, tiny little horse here, and they highlight the central toe that drastically lengthens and gets larger. So you can see that as it changes through the time, it gets longer and longer, but we end up with just a central toe here. This diagram right here is depicting the teeth.
Oh, dude, I want one with 4 toes.
We can also look at anatomical evidence for evolution. So homologous structures suggest that there was a common derivation in species. So if you look at human, lizard, cat, whale, bat, frog, bird here, they all have radius, ulna, carpals, metacarpals, and whatnot. Okay, so these structures, they are similar structures, but they have different functions. So this suggests that maybe all these organisms came from a common ancestor.
So homologous is similar structures.
Same. Okay, so it's like it's similar in structure, but they have different functions, but they have the same origin.
Same origin, similar structure, different function. And then
Yep.
analogous is similar structure
Similar function, different structure.
and different origin.
Like a insect wing with a bat's wing.
Okay.
They're both used for flights, but they are completely different structure.
So what is it? Homologous and
Analogous.
Analogous, yeah. We also have looked at embryonic development. So here I have some embryos of fish, reptile, bird, human, and they have very unique structures. Like we have gill slits in a stage of embryo, yet we don't have them when we're done. You know.
Sad.
we only wish.
Yeah.
So what happens with our gill slits is that they actually turn into glands and different ducts. So. Some structures are imperfectly suited for their use, so we know that natural selection only works on variation present in the population. So it's not surprising that some organisms do not appear perfected, adapted to their environment. So animals with long necks have many neck vertebrae. Geese have 25, Paleosaurus 76, mammals have 7, giraffes, hey, they only have 7. That's something very unique. And so giraffes, because they only have 7, that means that their vertebrae must be extremely large to account for their large necks. So variation was absent in natural selection. You don't just grow another vertebrae. So as a result, vertebrae size increased to produce the long necks in giraffes. One example that I don't think your book really talks about is the eye of a vertebrae versus the eye of a mollusk. So in a vertebrae, our eye actually faces backwards to the wall of the eye, and we have nerve fibers that extend towards the brain, or sorry, towards the eye chamber. So here's the back of the eye, and we have these receptors, and we see have these nerve fibers that run in the front, and we call this the optic nerve. Now, if you take anatomy or in anatomy, I taught it in anatomy, you can actually find your blind spot. Everyone has a blind spot, okay? And that blind spot is because of the nerve fiber that's actually blocking parts of your photoreceptors. Now, in a cephalopod, notice that they have their nice little cells right here all lined up to receive light, and then their fibers run behind. So therefore, mollusks, they're more optimally designed than we are, vertebrates are. They don't have a blind spot.
What's mollusks?
Kind of like squids,
Like an
octopus. Yeah.
Octopus are all seeing max.
Said better than
What do you think?
We also have vestigial structures,
that.
which explains kind of holdovers from the past. So maybe a structure that many years ago had a function but is no longer apparent in today's world. So we still have muscles in our ear that we can use to wiggle. Some people actually have this ability to wiggle their ears. My grandpa did. I can't. Okay. So like, what's the purpose of that? You know, we have an appendix that we don't use anymore. And so it's suggested that the appendix, it stores bacteria. And so when it suggests that maybe humans ate grass or types of grasses in the early, like thousands and thousands of years ago. And so the bacteria helped us digest and break down the cellulose, because we can't break down cellulose. So like when you eat corn, you're pretty much pooping out corn because it's made of cellulose. So you can't digest corn.
Why isn't your appendix up?
It's because now we eat meats and fruits and
We should still be eating grass and then our
What's
appendix
the
will work.
what about the male nipples? What was the point of those?
I don't know. Why do males have nipples?
Weird.
Just maybe
Okay. Another one that I want to point out, the tailbone, also known as the coccyx. Okay. So why do we have a tailbone? Did we have tails and they just got reduced? Our tailbone
Oh.
serves no purpose whatsoever.
That's crazy. What's the
Wisdom teeth. Okay, so the wisdom teeth kind of tie in with the appendix, because our wisdom teeth were like another set of teeth, and they're flat, kind of like molars to chomp grasses. So I mean, you could spend a whole semester on vestigial structures. Tonsils really don't have a purpose.
What would their purpose be? What are they? What do they do?
They don't do anything. They just get infected, and then you get sick all the time.
What about Darwin's point on the ear? What was that?
I don't know what that is. I don't know. But I want to emphasize coccyx right here and appendix. Okay? So moving on to vestigial structures in other organisms, boa constrictors and hip bones. So here's a picture of a whale. Yes, a whale does have hip bones. It has a femur and a pelvis. Why in the world does it have a femur? It doesn't have legs. Maybe because its ancestor had legs. Manatees have fingernails on their fins. What's the purpose of that? I don't know. Boa constrictors
Probably fight.
have hip bones.
Dirty.
So they must have had legs at some point in their
God.
life.
Imagine.
so you're saying it was a lizard at one point, no? Just
Yes.
Well, if you think about Adam and Eve and the classic story of the tree of knowledge. I don't know.
so,
Just think about that story for a second.
Satan.
Okay.
Zach is Satan.
Got
Um,
out of it.
I had a professor in college who was obsessed with snakes. And actually, the
That's weird.
boa constrictors, when they copulate, when they get it on, they actually kind of use the hip bones to grasp the female.
God, that's dirty.
So, I don't know. Okay, moving on.
Kill all snakes. Dude, I hate snakes so much.
Burn them.
Literally.
Caroline's just laughing it up over there. Okay, Herman, if you have to leave, I understand. So I'll pick up. This is where I probably will pick up with you guys, but I'm just going to keep going, and then I'll just quickly review tomorrow for you. Okay.
Sounds good. Are you going to put it on the website?
Yes, I will. Unless you just want to watch it there, too. I don't know. Is Ashley there?
All right, sounds good. No.
It's like a
Bulldog.
Okay, another piece of evidence for evolution is called the biogeography, which is the study of geographic distribution of species in the world. And so what biogeography reveals is that, yes, there are different geographic areas that sometimes exhibit the same groups of plants and animals that are very similar. For example, in South America, there are the poisonous dart frogs. But in Africa, they also have poison dart frogs. Well, they're not poison dart, they're a different brand or a different species. But they still have bright colorization, and they still secrete poison on their skin as a defense mechanism. So they have the bright colors to warn predators, saying, "Hey, don't eat me, because I'll kill you." But they also just secrete the poisons. And so we call this biogeography. We have two species that are very similar to each other, but they are not related at all. We've looked at the DNA, and they are not. They're just different species. So natural selection appears to have favored parallel evolutionary adaptations in similar environments. And so if you remember in Pangea, how all the continents were kind of fitted together in one giant supercontinent. So all these species, they were similar at one point, and then when the continents broke apart, they kind of evolved on their own. So we call this convergent evolution. I'm actually reading this book called Fingerprints of the God, which talks about ancient aliens and civilizations, and it's actually a really good book. But anyways, in this book, they're talking about Antarctica, and they have found that the ice on Antarctica is only 20,000 years old. It's only 20,000 years old, okay? Before the ice, it was a tropical area. There's fossilized forests underneath Antarctica.
They found like flowers and like ice.
Yeah.
We're bringing it back. Making it
So
tropical.
we're
So-
saying that literally Antarctica was near the equator at one point.
Possibly, yeah.
And then, boom.
Okay. So this is convergent evolution. So one example of convergent evolution is the marsupials and placentals. So marsupials, they're mammals, and they have pouches. Your platypus is a marsupial.
Why do they
So
all
the
live in
kangaroo.
Australia?
What?
Why do they all live in Australia?
Because of convergent evolution.
Possums don't.
So if I go back here,
Possums live in
here's
Virginia.
Australia. We'll say here's the mainland of India and all the others. And when the islands broke apart, Australia is an island, so the organisms, they evolved on their own, convergent evolution. So marsupials, they have a pouch. Placentals, they have a placenta. Okay? So
Not cool.
they evolved in very similar ways, but in different parts of the world. But they have a common ancestor.
What is the top thing on placenta?
What?
What is the top thing on placenta?
Fossil. That looks like a saber-toothed tiger, and there's a saber-toothed tiger, but they're different. Or they're not. They look like saber-toothed tigers.
Think of a saber-toothed tiger, Max, with another saber-toothed
Okay.
tiger in its pouch.
Marsupials. Their young are born in a very immature condition. Have you ever seen like a super, super baby kangaroo? Once it's born, it's like really, really tiny. And so it's held in the pouch until it's ready to come out into the world, until it's like fully developed. Placentals, however, we keep it inside ourselves, and they're not born until they are fully developed. And then they come out.
I always think of like the
when the
pouch.
mom just falls on her stomach with the kangaroo in the pouch.
That's why they have 4 legs, Zach.
So Australia separated more than 70 million years ago, at the time when marsupials and placental mammals evolved, but in different places. Marsupials are found in Australia, and so today the only placentas on Australia are bats and a few rodents.
Really?
Most of the mammals there are marsupials. So what are marsupials like? Well, they actually kind of resemble the placental mammals today. So here I have placental mammals: mole, anteater, mouse, lemur, flying squirrel, bobcat, wolf. Here I have my Australian marsupials, where I have a marsupial mole,
Tiger cat.
a numbat, marsupial mouse, spotted cuscus, flying phalanger. That's a cool name. A Tasmanian tiger cat, and the Tasmanian wolf.
Alright, their animals are way sweeter.
Oh, Tasmanian wolf, a tiger cat, a flying phalanger, whatever that is.
Spotted cuscus.
Okay, so yes, convergent evolution is a widespread phenomena. So the species, they interact with the environment in similar ways, but they were obviously exposed to similar selection pressures because they're similar to each other. So you have the hydrodynamics of dolphins, sharks, and tuna, how they're able to swim in the water. They have similar, like a dorsal fin, but their caudal fins are slightly different. Island trees. tall, tough outer covering. But if these island trees were located elsewhere, they would be flowers, shrubs, or small bushes. And they're actually members of the sunflower family. I don't know if you know that.
Trees?
Island trees.
Just-
Biogeographical studies have provided further evidence for evolution. Islands missing common animals found on continents, that's definitely one. Species present on the islands have diverged from continental relatives. We have island species that are closely related to species on nearby continents, suggesting that somehow the island species were dispersed there from the mainland. There is absence of some types of plants and animals that provides opportunities for others. So because it doesn't have its competitors, it can thrive and evolve. And then, like I said, Pangea. Earth's continents have not always been where they are today. Continental drift.
We just got a blank page. It's gonna start with those critics.
Yes. This is where I usually give out an essay assignment, but I'm not doing that.
Oh, thank God. Thank God.
It was actually one of my favorite assignments last year.
Is that one they had to do with evolution?
Would we
Yep.
just roast Darwin or what?
Actually, you roast him, but then you also support him. You have to present both sides.
Oh.
And then at the very end, you pick which one you actually believed.
So in other words,
Specialize in the roasting.
So Darwin obviously has a lot of critics. He still is criticized today by people. And so the last section of the chapter, I'll just like briefly say them. They say evolution is not demonstrated. Well, we've talked about Peter and Rosemary Grant with the finches, and we looked at guppies. On another one, there are no fossil intermediates. Okay, we have found fossils for that. The intelligent design argument, that's actually a good one. Evolution violates the second law of thermodynamics, which we have discussed. Like if you have a pile of, like, things just always get more disordered. So like how can animals, undergo the second law of thermodynamics? Proteins are too improbable. Natural selection does not imply evolution. And the inducible complexity argument, which is obviously more complex. But lots of critics. You won't be tested on any of that in your exam, but I'll just save that for college if you guys ever take a class like that. Okay, I'm done.